Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Podcast Daily. It is Monday. It is April the 10th. We hope everyone had a wonderful Easter with their families or by themselves, if that's what you prefer. Some people do. I mean, some people's families suck. So I understand if you didn't want to spend time with them. That's Bill Landis. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. It is, as I said, Monday. It means we got a little bit of Roosters coming later in the day. We got a little live press conference with Ryan Day coming on the podcast. But before then, Bill, it's the Daily. And Ohio State, if you haven't noticed, has not been eradicated on the recruiting trail, as some have suggested. The Buckeyes stayed hot over the weekend, adding four-star quarterback commitment Air Noland from Langston Hughes High School in Fairburn, Georgia on Saturday night. Four-star quarterback. Some recruiting rankings have him as a top 5 quarterback in the country. Some have him as top 10. Either way, by the time this season is over, I wouldn't be surprised if he's ranked in the top 3 or 4 across all the major networks. Did you watch his tape, Bill? Let's just break it down there and start. What did you see on tape from Air Noland that you personally liked?
The touch and the accuracy, I think, are the two things that jump out. I know, like, statistically, he's not a guy who's thrown a ton of interceptions, which you love to see. I love that he plays at a high level of high school football in Georgia for a good program and has been the starter there for a couple of years. I think he'll be a 3-year starter, right, by the time he comes out. It's weird because he's left-handed, right? Because you try to compare him to people and it just looks weird because he's a lefty. But if you can remove that from the equation, I did feel like I saw a little bit of CJ Stroud to him, just with the way that he can kind of place the ball, and maybe he doesn't have a howitzer attached to his shoulder, and that's something that can get better over development in college. CJ's arm strength got much better in college, but just in terms of being able to see where the openings in the defense are going to come and then get the ball there accurately in a place where kind of only his guy can catch it. I think those were the things that stuck out the most to me.
Yeah, when I was talking to Air on his interview, the Bermanology commitment interview, I told him that I saw a little bit of CJ. I don't know if I see the BPS, the pure ball placement specialist that CJ is yet. That, high school is a little different. You can get away with things maybe a little bit more than you would in the college game, and certainly more than you would once you get past college. But the makings of what you want to see are there. And you mentioned the one thing to me that really stands out. He threw 55 touchdowns. He threw almost 325 passes as a junior and only threw 4 interceptions. And when you're playing at that high level in Georgia, you're playing 6A. That's the second highest level in Georgia, which is probably the most competitive state in the country right now when it comes to high school football across all divisions. It's a really, really good starting point for Ohio State and Ryan Day to have a guy who's 6'3", 190 pounds. He said he'll be 200 by the time the season starts, and that's where he wants to play, which means you could put him by the time he's ever needed at Ohio State in that 6'3", 215, 220 pound range. And he told me that he thinks he throws like a right-hander, but except he's left-handed. And I don't know that I see that because my brain can't work that way. I can't invert it in my head, but I think there's really a lot to like. And I've talked to a number of people around the Ohio State program about the quarterback recruiting, path this year. I do believe, and I say this, and I know it'll be construed as saying that trying to reshape a narrative or whatever. So you can believe it or not. People I talked to said there's only 2 quarterbacks in the country right now that Ohio State would have taken a commitment from, and Air Noland was one of them. And so when you look at that, and I don't mean that uncommitted quarterbacks, I mean anyone, period. So when you look at it from that perspective, clearly they were very high on him. They began recruiting him extremely hard back in October, but at that point, Dylan Raiola was committed to Ohio State. There was no need for an offer. The Buckeyes went and visited him in January. As soon as they were allowed on the road to watch him throw, they could have offered him then, Bill, but they didn't. And the primary reason they didn't, from what I understand, is because they wanted to make sure that Air was serious about Ohio State. So they said to him, if you're serious about us and you're not just looking for a clout offer, come see us and come do it on your own dime. Let us, get to know you a little bit more in person with your family. That happened. The offer came. A week later, the commitment came. And I think it just shows again how incredibly dominant Ohio State is recruiting quarterbacks right now. They simply can just go get pretty much anyone they want to at the position. And it is such a huge departure from where we were watching this program 10 years ago to now that it's almost shocking.
It is. Well, you almost take it for granted now because they've been so good at it for so long. It did feel to me like you're obviously much closer to these recruitments than I tend to be. it on the outside, it almost felt like a kind of a rush process to get Air. He like offered him. He announced his top 6 or whatever, then got offered and then committed like a week later. But it does sound like it was a more deliberate process than that, and that the offer was maybe almost it was like understood, like as long as you come and like we don't get around you in person and think you're a jerk, and clearly that didn't happen. So it wasn't like a rush thing just to make up for the fact they didn't have a quarterback in this class. It did feel like a thorough process for Ohio State's evaluation of Air Noland. And it is funny, like at a time when people are like questioning, like, oh, Ohio State's recruiting is slipping. And I think there are like some fair questions to get into when it comes to that conversation, but it's certainly not with quarterback and not with receiver. And it is a tremendous luxury for Ohio State to be able to just like tap into that whenever it wants to. Like, oh, you think we're slipping? Watch this. Here's a 5-star receiver. You think we're slipping? Here's a top 10 quarterback. Like, this is easy for them. It shouldn't be, but it seems like it is very easy for them to do this.
It's what's interesting to me about that conversation. And Braylon Edwards, the former Michigan receiver, took a shot on someone's podcast or what. I don't know where it came from. I just saw the quote that Ohio State was a program in decline and that the Buckeyes are on the same level as Michigan was when they lost to Appalachian State in 2007 or something like that. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I'm dumb. I mean, I'm definitely dumb, but maybe I'm like super dumb. But I thought Ohio State was one play away from winning the national championship really a year ago. So I'm not sure how you can compare those two locations of program relevancy, because of Michigan was the number 5 team in the country when it lost to Appalachian State and then felt like they didn't win another game for 10 years. Ohio State was basically going to beat Georgia if Marvin Harrison doesn't get knocked out of the game. And I know ifs and buts were candy and nuts, whatever, but like that doesn't seem like an apples to apples comparison. But to your point, like there are some areas on the team and the roster and recruiting where you can go, man, that doesn't feel like the way it used to feel. But I don't know that that's an Ohio State specific issue. Even if you look at Michigan's class, Michigan has 11 commitments in the class of 2024. Ohio State now has 9 and passed the Wolverines in the national rankings with the commitment of Air Noland. Like, these are not classes that are just full of like studs on the defensive side of the ball. Like, I think what we're seeing is the Big Ten in general, like you almost have to be much more thorough in evaluation and finding diamonds in the rough on defense than ever before in the Big Ten, because quite frankly, kids around the country simply believe you have to play in the SEC if you want to be a dominant defensive player. And I don't know where that comes from, because Georgia gave up 45 points a game in their last 2 games, leading how many points? Well, TCU doesn't count. That game wasn't a real game, but they gave up what, 45 to LSU, or 40 to LSU, 35 to LSU, 40 to Ohio State, like 550 yards to each. It's not like those defenses were just world beaters. I mean, they were still, the game has changed, but kids are buying into that hype, it seems like, in the South.
Yeah, eventually I think a good defense is going to get more often in college football. So it is an interesting narrative. I think part of it is just like geography in general, right? You don't see a lot of these freaky defensive linemen in particular, like north of the Mason-Dixon line. They're all kind of an SEC and ACC country. That's been a struggle for Ohio State. Well, I mean, as far back as I can remember, trying to land those kind of guys. Sometimes they get them. Sometimes they're in Maryland instead of in Georgia, and you get Chase Young. And when those guys exist, I think it puts an increased pressure on you to get a guy like that. And, they got Jason Moore last year, I think is a guy with a lot of upside who is probably has those kind of athletic traits that you think about more with Southern defensive linemen. But that is, like, to me, the position. Like, I look at this class and the way it's coming together. Quarterback is good. Receiver is awesome as it always is. Like, I think offensive line is trending in a really good direction with what Justin Fry's done this year, and that's a good sign. But it almost feels to me like it's going to hinge on whatever Larry Johnson can do with the defensive line. That's how 2023 was. It was a top 5 class in the country, but it felt disappointing because none of those big time defensive ends joined the class. But if you look otherwise top to bottom, like, it's a pretty darn good class. Here we are. It's only April 10th, Bill, and you have a commitment from your quarterback. You have your running back. Both of those 2 guys were players that people weren't even talking about really being committed to Ohio State this early. We initially thinking June. Wide receiver, you have 5-star wide receiver Jeremiah Smith, 5-star wide receiver Mylan Graham. You have the number 1 ranked tackle in the country on the Rivals database in Ian Moore. You have 3 really good
admittedly probably developmental players in Devontae Armstrong, and Mark Nave on the offensive line to join them while you're swinging for big fish like Brandon Baker out in California or Jordan Seaton or Garrity Lambert. Tight end wise, you have Demarion Witten close to home at Cleveland Glenville. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes a decision earlier than later based on what I'm hearing. Max LeBlanc, a highly ranked 4-star tight end from Nashville by way of Canada, who dropped his Final Four schools on Thursday night. I think he's going to end up in the Ohio State class. I really do. So you could have almost the entire offense minus like Sam Williams-Dixon from Pickerington North. I'd expect that his commitment will be over soon. Outside of going after those two really big fish that you want still on the offensive line, the offense is done.
Yeah,
like that's kind of crazy. But then you look on defense, you have 9 commitments right now, and one's on defense, and that's Garrett Stover. That's not ideal. But
right.
What you could already see the makings and the shell of what's coming around Garrett Stover with Reggie Powers from Centerville, Ohio, who had the offer 3 weeks ago, and probably I would imagine will commit in the near future. You have Aaron Scott and Bryce West, who, despite all of the rancor about where they might go, like it's going to be a major shock if they don't end up at Ohio State. Sunday afternoon, you have Miles Lockhart, a 4-star cornerback from Arizona who arrived on campus for a couple-day visit. If he doesn't commit to Ohio State this summer, I will be shocked. He's been very adamant that the Buckeyes are his leader. Zabian Brown from California, a 4-star cornerback, top 5 corner from Mater Dei out there in Santa Ana, California. He's coming back this week for the second visit to the school in 2 weeks. Like, you don't take 2 visits to Ohio State from California in 2 weeks unless something is very, very real there. Peyton Pierce at linebacker, you feel very, very good about that. Edwin Spillman at linebacker in Tennessee, feel very good about that. Kingston Viamu Asa. That's a hard name to say.
That's a tough one.
Feel very good about that. You can see the shell. KJ Bolden, you're swinging at the number 1 ranked safety in the country. All these guys, like, you can sort of just write them down and say, okay, I feel pretty good about this, feel pretty good about this. And then you get to the defensive line and you're like, what is going on here? And some of that, Bill, is I think just because the NIL space is so different for defensive linemen than it is other positions. Some of that is, as you said, most of those kids are just not around Ohio and in their heart of SEC country. Some of that is because, for whatever reason, defensive linemen seem to be very big mama's boys and they never want to leave home. I don't know why that is either, but it feels that way. But that's why a guy like Dylan Stewart in Maryland, a la Chase Young, at friendly like that Friendship High School, DC Friendship Academy, where he's at. Like, that's a cool name for a school, the Friendship Academy.
It's nice. It's pleasant.
Yeah, makes me want to go there. But Ohio State needs to go there and make sure Dylan Stewart, the number 1 ranked defensive lineman in the country, after not signing a defensive end or true defensive end in 2023, like, you got to hit a home run there. They hit an absolute home run with Edric Houston, the 5-star defensive end from Buford High School in Georgia, who was on campus on Friday. I really think Ohio State is a much better shot in that battle than people are giving them credit for, because the kid's from the South, but Buford's a little bit different in a lot of ways. Like, you can start to see things percolating a little bit, but I think people are just on edge because what happened a year ago is you had those 3 names that they were just there the whole time. And, there's no way you're not going to get at least one of those 3. Heck, may even get 2. And then to go over, really, I think, like, damage people's psyches.
Yeah, that, and I think, like, maybe Caleb Downs kind of piled on top of that too. That's and I get it, right? It is a weird thing, and I suppose it's just a matter of the success that Ohio State has had on the offensive side of the ball. It's like the things that would, like, concern you about these defensive recruits, I think would concern you about the offensive players too. But Ohio State just seems to get over that hump with the offensive players, and they don't seem to do it for the defensive guys. And I don't know what that is. Like, clearly the program's been down a little bit defensively, but, like, they were pretty good last year, I thought. Certainly better than they were the 2 previous years. It does seem like there's a little bit of momentum there, and maybe that is going to show itself or show the benefits on the trail in this cycle. Because the thing about it is, like, their 2021 and 2022 classes were, in addition to being just, like, very good, were pretty well balanced. So it's not like 2023 was the continuation of a downward cycle of not being able to get defensive players or high level defensive players, I should say, particularly on the defensive line. It was like, if it's a momentary dip and it's a 1 year thing, then that's okay. And Ohio State can rebound in a really nice way here in 2024. Just like for some reason, like I get a little nervous about it. If I were an Ohio State fan, I'd be a little nervous about the ability to close on that side of the ball for, like, I don't know, all the guys you just mentioned who aren't from Ohio or the Midwest.
Yeah, and Ryan Day talked about it pretty extensively on signing day. Like, Ohio State is needing to adjust. They're needing to learn the new system and how to make this work in the new world of recruiting. And I think that they've shown already in this cycle that they are cognizant of that and willing to maybe move a little bit as the wind blows. But it's also, I think people look at this all of a sudden, they're so hot on the recruiting trail. They almost purposefully did nothing in January and February on the recruiting trail because they just don't think it's necessary to bring kids to Columbus when there's no football being played. The basketball team is not like taking them to a basketball game isn't going to get the juices flowing.
It would be to their detriment.
Right. It's not like the atmosphere there is not exactly what you're trying to sell, players on the excitement, feel the heat. That's not exactly the spot to do it. The Buckeyes have a very good plan in place for what they want to do. And here we are again, April 10th. They only have 9 commitments, but it feels like, again, the offense is pretty close to finished and wrapped up. And so Justin Fry, who's done a nice job in this cycle, will sort of be on the clock next, I guess, to really wrap up this class with two studs from around the country. But there's nothing to suggest from what he's shown that he can't do that. And then James Laurinaitis and Jim Knowles, that duo are really in a position where they could take maybe 4 linebackers in this class. I think the biggest thing that's different between this year and last year, as far as Ohio State's defensive recruiting, is continuity, period. And you now have an entire staff that's returned. There's been no changes for the first time in what feels like forever on the Ohio State coaching staff. I think that's going to pay off because Perry Eliano and Tim Walton did a good job a year ago. I think Tim Walton has been so unfairly judged by his fan base for some reason, as far as he didn't do a good enough job on the recruiting trail last year. Calvin Simpson-Hunt and Jermaine Matthews are 2 of the top 5 corners in the country, and then he added Davis and Igbinosun in the portal when you lost Kyan Lee to Auburn on signing day. That's a pretty good class. Perry Eliano brought in 3 really, really good safeties in Cedric Hawkins, Jaden Bonsu, and Malik Hartford, who's already lost his black stripe. We just aren't seeing them on the roster yet because Bonsu and Hawkins do not arrive until June. But if you look at this cycle, the Reggie Powers, it seems imminent, and then it's all about KJ Bolden. And like when you're talking about lessons learned, did they learn anything or enough from the Caleb Downs recruitment to know how to play the KJ Bolden recruitment? It's a little bit different. He's not. Perry Eliano is quite literally related to KJ Bolden. It's not like they're, blood brothers or whatever, but they're cousins separated by, a couple degrees, but they are related, and that should help at least keep the thing moving in the right direction. But you're still recruiting against Georgia and Alabama and Clemson for a kid from Atlanta, and that is not going to ever be easy.
No, it's not. And it's not. There was a very short window or very small window, I think, where you would feel pretty good, I think, about Ohio State's chances of winning a battle like that, maybe like in a 2017, 16, 17, 18 kind of range. But that's changed now with Georgia's emergence as probably the best program in college football. So it's a different story now. So if you do not win those, like it's not necessarily the end of the world. I suppose it raises the question, like, do you keep putting yourself in those battles if you continue to lose them, or do you try to pick those battles elsewhere? I don't know. I guess we'll see how that plays out before addressing that question. Safety is interesting to me because I feel like corner has a little bit of juice, and maybe that's just a byproduct of having 2 really good guys in the state in this cycle, and Bryce West and Aaron Scott. If those guys were like from Florida, maybe it'd be different. But it does feel like Tim Walton's got a little bit of credibility built up and some momentum from last year's class. And I do like the trio they brought in at safety last year. Like I don't say this to like undersell what they did in 2023, but you just can't help but feel like it was a little bit of a letdown because of the Caleb Downs situation. So I am on the lookout for that position in particular to like try and swing and get a really big win this cycle. And if they do, then I think you need to feel pretty good about the overall kind of trajectory of defensive recruiting moving forward, as long as I can keep the continuity with the staff.
Yeah, the reality is a guy like Caleb Downs is just different. Like that, you're going to find one of those guys every 3-4 years where you could, and it sounds crazy to say because he hasn't played even a spring game at Alabama. Like he's very likely going to be a starting safety at Alabama as a true freshman. Like that's a rare type of dude, but that's why Ohio State goes out and recruits those types of guys. Like they have to keep putting themselves in that mix. But it also means that when you have to recruit more locally and pick and choose guys to sort of be developmental prospects in your own backyard, guys like Reggie Powers, for example, like they have to hit. Those guys can't be misses. So, it is about being very thorough in your local evaluations and making sure you're picking the right ones, because everyone around Ohio is going to say, hey, well, why don't you just take this guy and this guy? I mean, we've seen it already in this cycle on the offensive line with the conversation about Luke Hamilton and Ben Roebuck, the two commitments for Michigan from Northeast Ohio. Like, why not just go offer these guys? Michigan likes them. You should too. Like Justin Fry's not being paid by Michigan, right? Like he's being paid.
Yeah,
by
they're not looking for the same thing. Like it's two different offenses. Like you prioritize different skill sets,
right?
And also too, like I don't know. I think the guys that Ohio State took seemed to me like a little more like Ohio State players than the guys they didn't offer that went to Michigan. Just my personal opinion.
And it's obviously Justin Fry's opinion, because that's why, again, if Ryan Day has to trust that evaluation. If you're not, then you have the wrong offensive line coach. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, Michigan offered this guy, you should too. Like, Michigan's had a good offensive line the last 2 years. It's a much different style of offense. I'm pretty sure Ohio State had a pretty good offensive line the last 2 years as well. And they're maybe, going to have first 2 day picks in the NFL draft. 2 day first. You know what I mean?
3 guys taken in the first 2 days.
There you have it. Yeah. Easter got to my brain. That's pretty good. I mean, and then you have Donovan Jackson, who's going to be a 2 day first picked in the first 2 days next year. Like that's pretty good. So they're just different. And Ohio State can't take everyone in the state of Ohio and then expect to compete nationally, because that's not how it works anymore. And that's not how it worked 15 years ago. I mean, it worked that way for Jim Tressel, but Jim Tressel was recruiting in a world that was much, much different. And Ohio's demographics have changed quite a bit. And the reality of college football has changed quite a bit, because Alabama was dead and Georgia was dead. And, now they're not. And also, I don't know if you know this, there's so much freaking talent in Georgia. It's crazy.
Like, it's pretty insane.
It's nuts. I can't even imagine. Like, Atlanta's a big city. I understand that. I don't know how much bigger it is in Columbus. How many people are in Atlanta? 7-8 million, maybe?
No, I don't think it's that many. But it's bigger than Columbus. It's bigger than Columbus.
You can't walk within a 3-foot radius without hitting a Division I football player in that area. It is nuts how good they are. And then you couple that with the fact that those teams can also recruit from Florida and South Carolina and Alabama. Like it is an uphill battle for the people in the Big Ten right now. And I think the fact that you see Ohio State and Michigan right now, both in the top 5 nationally, like says something about what those schools are doing and what people view, how they view them. But as we've seen in the last few cycles, when Georgia and Alabama and LSU and these schools really kick up their energy is October, November, December. And something like the fact that Ohio State maintained a top 5 class last year, considering how subjectively they struggled at times to have any momentum, it speaks volumes about the Ohio State reputation. And it's shocking to me that people are looking at this program and still saying, oh, well, they're falling apart. They're falling apart, Bill. Falling apart.
Yeah. It's been drastically overstated. And I think like it can be true that Michigan appears to finally be cashing in on its momentum on the recruiting trail, and it's not coming really at the expense of Ohio State. Like Ohio State is still Ohio State, and Michigan seems to be elevating itself a little bit. That's fine. That's good. I think that's great. But like, because Michigan got one running back from Cincinnati that Ohio State wanted and like in my opinion should have gotten, it was a bad loss that doesn't suddenly like change the tide of what's happening between these two programs. If Michigan does it again, and then like maybe a third time in one cycle, or in like back-to-back years does it a handful of times, that like, yeah, like, maybe it's a conversation worth happening or worth having.
Yeah.
But one guy, which granted is a really good win for Michigan and a loss for Ohio State, doesn't really change the overarching thought here that like Ohio State is fine, and also appears, to your point, as you mentioned earlier, perhaps appears to be learning a little bit about how to play ball differently in this new landscape. We'll see if it pays dividends on the defensive side, but it does seem like they've at least learned some lessons.
Yeah, and as difficult as that loss was, they replaced it and mitigated it 2 weeks later by recruiting a player that is ranked higher across most of the national recruiting services in James Peoples. So like, it's not to say James Peoples is better than Jordan Marshall. That's obviously a matter of people's personal opinion. But they're both pretty darn good players. And this is the simple truth. When it comes to Ohio State's big picture recruiting and their ability to go out and find great players from around the country and get guys from Georgia to come up north and play in the Big Ten, Ohio State, I hate to say it, needs a super strong Michigan, needs a strong Penn State, needs a strong Wisconsin. Like, these kids stay in the South and go to the SEC because they are told you're going to get the best competition week in and week out in the SEC, and that's how you're going to survive. The idea that Ohio State has to be the only team in the Big Ten winning games is part of the problem that the Big Ten has had in the last 20 years. Like, Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer suffocated the Big Ten in a way that nobody else was good. And so kids started to realize, why go play in the Big Ten when I can go to Mississippi State and play against, the best of the best every week, when those players should be going to Purdue or Michigan State and doing the same thing. And the Big Ten needs everyone to be good. And sometimes, if that's the case, it means Ohio State's going to lose games. But the playoffs expanding, and that's okay. Like, just a lot of these conversations are going to change so dramatically after the 2024 season, when the playoff is out to 12 teams, because you don't have to go undefeated every time. Like, and I really think that the entire recruiting world is going to change once you start to realize that you can win a national championship and still lose a game every other year or so to your rival. Like, that's how rivalries work, isn't it?
It is how rivalries work. And you would have a better read on this than I do. Like, it's something that doesn't get talked about a ton, I think, in recruitment. Like, you hear about, I want to win a national championship. Maybe first and foremost, I want to get to the NFL, and probably I want to get the NIL bag out now too. But then also win a national championship. But like, playing competitive football against like other good teams matters, right? Like, you don't want to.
A lot more than people think.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
It is one of those things. There are a handful of defensive back prospects that Ohio State has recruited in the last couple of years in the Southern U.S. that have trainers who have coached in the NFL and have played in the SEC, who are telling them very specifically, do not go anywhere other than the SEC because you will not be ready for the NFL, which is garbage. I mean, that's not true, but it is also true that you are more ready if you are playing against NFL caliber talent every week in, week out. And that is what the SEC has been able to do with Florida, with LSU, with Georgia, with Alabama, with a number of other schools, having Ole Miss. I mean, there's now you got A&M, like then you had Texas and Oklahoma. Like, that is how you get better, and kids are aware of that. And I think it's an interesting conversation Ohio State fans have had to have internally the last few years. Like, do you want a strong Michigan? Do you want them to do you want Michigan to lose every game, or do you want them to be undefeated and only lose to Ohio State? Like, I think for the long-term growth and benefit of the Big Ten as programs and on the recruiting trail, especially, like, you have to win as a conference. And I know that it's ironically in some way, like, Ohio State and Michigan are telling kids this year in the recruiting trail, the Big Ten is the conference that had 2 playoff teams last year, right? Like, that, not the SEC. So in some ways, like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I guess, because Ohio State and Michigan have to band together and recruit against the SEC together. Like, hey, you can come here and still make the playoff and not, stay home and experience other things and go out and stretch your legs and be your own man and blah, blah, blah. I just think it's funny that Michigan, because Ohio State has been down, quote unquote, like their willingness to quickly try to like take kill shots in media and take, like, I do not understand it. Like it is, I guess after 20 years of being like embarrassed, you have to strike back when you can, but it seems like all they're doing is poking the bear. And you can see in the Ohio State coaching staff, like their responses on social media in the last couple of weeks as things have started to, pick back up on the recruiting trail. They're like, we're not dead. It's not over. So it's fun.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, I think the back and forth, or it's not even really a back and forth. It's just it's a fourth, I guess. It's coming from one side. It's fun, but I think you also have to be like honest about what's happening. Like not every Michigan recruiting win is a dub against Ohio State, no matter how hard you want it to be. But I appreciate the trash talk back and forth. Like, I don't think Jaden Davis is going to rate Ohio State's recruiting class, but I think it's kind of fun that he talks about it. And like getting Ben Roebuck and Luke Hamilton was not a win over Ohio State. But if you want to tout winning in Ohio again, if you're Michigan, because you haven't done it in forever, I think that spices things up a little bit too. So if you don't take it seriously, I think it can be fun. If you do take it seriously, then you're just being sort of intellectually dishonest if you're doing it from the Michigan side.
Yeah, Air Noland's commitment is interesting. Obviously, Michigan gets their quarterback a week ago. Ohio State gets their quarterback now. Michigan got a running back. Ohio State got a running back. Mylan Graham, Michigan was like, come on, come visit. Let's show you. And he kept telling Michigan media members, I'm thinking about visiting. Like he had committed to Ohio State weeks ago, and he knew it. Like, that's a win. Like that's a win over that school. What's fascinating is to see the difference, I think, in what we'll see displayed from Air Noland versus the conversations around Jaden Davis and his attempts to build their class. And I like Jaden. I'm not trying to knock him, but he's going to be forced in some ways to talk. Hey, who are you going after? Who's the guy? How are you going to screw Ohio State? Like that's really the conversation. It's when Air Noland is talking about who he's recruiting, it's not about who's Michigan going after. And that ultimately is the difference between Ohio State and Michigan still on the recruiting trail. The conversation around Air Noland and who he'll be targeting to bring to Ohio State is, who does Georgia want? Who does Alabama want? How can we get those guys? Whereas Michigan's still is, who's Ohio State recruiting? Let's try to take them. And until I don't really, I guess I get that because they're engaged in a much more direct assault, I think, in some ways on Ohio State to try to cripple the Buckeyes brand as opposed to just elevating their own, because I think they see what Ohio State did the last 20 years. And if you can eliminate your biggest competition in the conference, the rest of the conference will, not be a problem. But it is telling to me that Ohio State's concern is, who is Georgia recruiting, who's Alabama recruiting, and Michigan's is, let's go steal Ohio State commits. Like, it seems weird. It
almost feels like Michigan. This will, I guess, sound weird because Michigan's been in the playoff now, but it still feels like they're kind of fighting on one front, and it's the Ohio State front, and Ohio State's kind of fighting on two. And I think when you are fighting on two, it can give the impression that you're in like a little bit of disarray, or maybe perhaps unorganized. And if you're just focusing on one point, you can give the impression that you're a little more organized. But I don't think that's the case. I think that's probably a misconception about each program. I think Michigan probably has higher aspirations than merely being a thorn in Ohio State's side. And Ohio State is not nearly as in a state of falling apart as people would like you to believe.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, the reality is Ohio State was in that mode, attack Michigan for 10 years, and then you weren't winning national championships. So then you have to divert, resources a little bit, and Michigan will be forced to do the same thing because they've made the playoffs 2 years in a row and have lost 2 years in a row and done so in spectacular fashion 2 years in a row. So like, how do you fix that? They're gonna. Right now, everything that they do seems to be building a roster, building a program to beat Ohio State, where Ohio State's focus looks like it's build a roster to compete against the SEC. And you're going to have to find a way to do both. You're going to have to find a way to build a roster that can win on both fronts. Ohio State's roster, obviously people talk about all the time. Every time we get a commitment video done at Ohio State. Oh, well, why is it only quarterbacks? Why is it only wide receivers? Where's the other guys? Like, I get it, and I totally understand that. But Ohio State is recruiting those players to compete against Alabama and Georgia. Now, you're going to have to be able to win in the trenches if you're going to win in the Big Ten in November. So that it does put the conference at whole in a bit of a disadvantage, because you have to recruit and play in slog in a gale in Chicago in November. Like, you have to be able to find a way to do that. So the cool thing about college football is that you can recruit a roster that does both. Like, you have 85 guys. You don't have to have a air raid only. So who knows? It's fun. I just like talking about recruiting, Bill. It's fun to me. I'm glad Austin decided to take today off so we could talk about recruiting.
I also enjoy talking about recruiting. I have a question for you before we finish.
Sure.
So as we said earlier on, it seems like a lot of the heavy lifting on the offensive side of the ball is done. There are a few holes left to fill there, and obviously getting a quarterback probably helps you fill those holes on that side of the ball. Can a quarterback commitment like Air Noland's generate momentum on the defensive side? Like, is there a class-wide impact of that, or is it more on the offensive side in your mind?
Good football teams are led by their quarterback, right? And they're player-led. That's how generally the best teams win. They're player-led. There's a couple ways Air can impact them. Number one, he's an incredibly bubbly personality guy that people are going to follow. Number two, he's in Georgia. There are a lot of guys within a 30-mile radius of where he lives that Ohio State is recruiting on the defensive side of the ball. So he's got good relationships there, and he can certainly help in that respect. He's also a player that has some national cachet, playing with South Florida Express and 7-on-7 tournaments. So he's been around the country and got to know people that way. The best way for any player to make an impact and recruiting other guys is just to be visible and be out there and doing the work. And Air told me that he's been recruiting for Ohio State even before he committed. He intends to keep doing the same thing. But the biggest way is because he's in Georgia. And I know, like, Georgia has a commitment from a quarterback in Ryan Puglisi from New Hampshire or Connecticut or somewhere up in the Northeast. All those states are basically the same. And they're obviously still recruiting Dylan Raiola and may very well be the team to land him. But the fact is, when you have a quarterback from Georgia, so Georgia didn't offer him, I get it, whatever. We'll see if that comes back to bite them in a few years. That's how you win in the South. You have to have guys from the South to win in the South. And when you have KJ Bolden nearby, when you have Edric Houston nearby, you have a lot of dudes in Georgia that you're interested in, tight ends that are all over that state. That's how you win. So yeah, he's going to make an impact. And certainly he told me he's already been reaching out to Brandon Baker, the 5-star offensive lineman from California. And like, he wants to be as aggressive as possible. That will translate to the defense once they start getting a few more wins. Garrett Stover's sort of on an island, like, hello, me. What about me? So it's imperative, I think, for the Buckeyes to this momentum, this recruiting wave that they're on, to continue riding it into the next few weeks and to add a few guys on the defensive side of the ball before they really, come back to earth and reset for the June official visit push, where you hope that you can make an impact on guys around the country. Even, in California, like I said, I mean, you can see impact from Noland committing and recruiting Brandon Baker, because Brandon Baker's teammate Aiden Breland is one of the top defensive tackles on the Ohio State board. Zabian Brown, another teammate out there at Mater Dei. Ohio State's been waiting for years to really make a push at Mater Dei. If they could help, if Brandon Baker can help with Aiden Breland, who helps with Zabian Brown, there's at least a chance you could see 3 guys from Mater Dei in this one class for Ohio State. So it's all about just dominoes, and that's why it's really just important that Ohio State has had a little bit of leverage in these last few weeks and used it. And that is something that in the past, I don't think they would have been so eager to sort of turn the crank and say, hey, you want this spot, you better get it, because it's not going to be here forever. The last few years, they've been much more reluctant and much more willing to say, it's all about our relationship. We're here for you whenever. And you put yourself in a position then when kids are being motivated and twisted by a lot of different things and different people, different influences, to all of a sudden be like, now what? Now we're stuck. So It's cool.
Yeah,
It's cool to watch the evolution unfold.
it is. I think it is funny, and maybe it could be a question for Ryan Day at some point. Like
Maybe Monday.
Maybe Monday. Not that having a commitment guarantees you anything, but it seems like an awfully bad time to just kind of like leave kids twisting in the wind a little bit. Like I think you need to pull that trigger much sooner than maybe even you're comfortable with, because you can't, to your point, leave guys with that little seed of doubt in the back of their mind, and then an opening for anybody else from any other program in the country to tell them like, hey, are you sure they really want you when they haven't taken you yet? So and I don't know, maybe that's happened a time or two already in this cycle, but it seems like they're perhaps being a bit more aggressive to fight against that than they were last year, which is good.
Yeah, and the reality is, you're probably right. Like they may not want to make some of these decisions this early, but you have to, because there's not a lot of guys just standing out there waiting to be, to commit. And if you have an opportunity to bring in a player like Air Noland, even though the last couple of years Ohio State has benefited from waiting until like November, December to really make a move on the quarterback situation, that's not the way it is every time, and you have to be willing to adjust. Tony Gerdman from Buckeye Huddle tweeted the other day a list of like Ohio State's recent quarterback decommitments and where their path took them versus what Ohio State got in their place. And the Buckeyes have shown a remarkable ability to bounce back when they've missed or had a loss or a decommitment. And so some of that has been because they've had more time to evaluate and get that correct. So it just sort of puts the onus, I think, on Ryan Day and Corey Dennis to make sure that with Air Noland, you got the guy you wanted. And maybe it happened a skosh earlier than you anticipated, but that's kudos to Air and his family. They're the ones that put the pressure on, said, hey, we're committing on this day. You got to jump or pee or get off the pot, right? So they did. Everybody's peed now. Wonderful. We're at Roosters on Monday afternoon. We should be there, I think, probably about 12:30, because we have a Ryan Day press conference coming up at 10:30 on Monday morning. Yes.
Programming note. Jerry moved it to Wednesday. Ryan Day is now on Wednesday.
Oh, well, that just happened. So no Ryan Day on Monday. It'll only be Wednesday. That's cool. Means I have to make 2 drives to Columbus this week instead of no, it means I have to make 4 drives to Columbus this week instead of just 2. Love that. Awesome to see and hear. You're seeing the reaction in real time, how much I'm thrilled about that decision. So I guess screw me, right? That's the way it goes.
Happy Easter.
Anyway, this is the podcast daily for Monday. Enjoy. Thanks for watching. Bye.